Hello and welcome to the Malika Writes channel. My name is Malika Writes, and today we are doing a video in a completely new setting because Malika's at work, and so this is the room I sometimes use when I'm working, just because it has the board and it's a lot easier to use. Our usual setting is at home, so we are not home, and that's why we're doing things here. But I hope it's not too much of an inconvenience. I hope it's not too plain. Yes, you can see the ring light in the back, but ignore that. So today we are going to be carrying on with our witch series, and we are going to be talking about a story coming out of India. It's an Indian folktale called Indravati and the Seven Sisters. So, Indravati and the Seven Sisters is an Indian folktale about 7 beautiful witches who kidnap the husband of Indravati and attempt to sleep with him. Well, aren't they nice? Indravati rescues her husband and defeats the witches. So this story centers around a female protagonist, and Indravati is said to be very beautiful, and we get a nice healthy amount of description of how beautiful she is. And her mother very cleverly names her Indravati, which means the daughter of Indra, because Indra is the king of the fairy realm and he's very lustful. So when the mother saw her daughter and she was like, wow, this is going to be a beauty, she said, yeah, I should probably name her something that gives her some sort of immunity from this very lusty god. And so she names her daughter Indravati, which means daughter of Indra. And so that will stop Indra from biblically knowing Indravati. So, and as the story goes on, Indravati grows up and she marries the prince of another kingdom, and this prince is very handsome, beautiful, everything. We get a very healthy description of how beautiful he is, and the writer does not hold back on it, talking about his limbs and everything else. So we get a good description of that. So we have these 7 witches who are very beautiful, and we have a very graphic description of how beautiful they are and where exactly their beauty comes from, and it's not just from their faces, I can tell you that. So, and they are very sensual, whereas Indravati and her husband are beautiful in not always in an innocent way, because the prince is described, his manhood is described, so it's not always free of sexuality in terms of, and beauty in of itself is not always free of these things. It is as it is. So, but for the witches, it's more of their sensual appeal that their beauty is akin to. So we have a good description of that in the story. And they see the prince and they want him for themselves, but obviously he's a prince, he's heavily guarded, they can't just spring in there and take him. So Indravati and her husband, they get married, they have the wedding feast and everything. On their way to the prince's kingdom, they decide to take a nap because the journey's been long and the marriage feast has gone on for ages. So as they're taking a nap, the witches come and they snatch both of them. They drop Indravati from a very high height, but she luckily survives. They take the prince into a tower where they feed him aphrodisiacs, and they try to feed him aphrodisiacs, and they try to get him aroused so they can sleep with him. And we learn that their intentions aren't just to have one night with him. It's very vindictive. It's very much about stripping him of everything until he's like a flower that wilts. So they really want to take from him, and that's a key part of the sexuality of the witch archetype. It's not reciprocal. It's not loving in any sense. It's not even freeing. It's more about taking, stripping away. In a lot of folktales we have where men were warned that if you have sex with a witch, you're going to be impotent forever because she's going to take something very vital from you. You know, the whole thing of a succubus. And it goes even beyond that, where you could lose your manhood entirely. So that's very much at the core of the witch's sexuality. And even when we look back onto what the witch is born out of, which is the rage, that feminine rage, it's never anything positive. It's when something is born out of an emotion that powerful in a negative sense, it's always going to be about getting some sort of vengeance. So when we look at what the witch seven sisters want to do to Indravati's husband, they are not looking at him as, oh, he's just a prize that they want to keep. They actually want him to wither and die after they're done with him. So it's a lot more violent. There's that it's reminiscent of the Dionysian rituals, where women would go out and almost have a wild, ecstasy, drunken filled night, and if a man even so much as crossed their path, they would rip him to shreds. That's how Orpheus from Orpheus and Eurydice ends. He ends up being ripped to shreds by women performing a Dionysian ritual. So Indravati, she is basically living off the scraps that the witches throw out of the window every morning because the prince won't eat them. And she realizes that she's not going to be able to save her husband by herself. So she needs some sort of help. She notices the witches have, they go somewhere every day. And so she climbs onto the tree that they use as transportation, and with them she goes to the fairy realm. Now once in the fairy realm, Indravati is so beautiful that no one notices that she is not supposed to be there. No one notices that she's human. She's just too beautiful to be human. And so she's able to get into the court of Indra, and Indra is watching the seven sisters perform, and so he's having a jolly good time, and there's a lot of vivid description about how much he's enjoying this. Indravati herself is even pulled into this, and it's really important to note that the witches are so attractive that even women, even Indravati, who is so beautiful that she can, rivals the fairies, is seduced by their dance. But she manages to snap herself out of it, and she calls out to Indra. Now Indra is in this sort of trance, he's watching, he's very aroused, and so to have someone snap him out of it, he's very angry because he's messed himself, to be polite about it. And so he looks out to this to the person who called out to him, and he sees a very beautiful woman, and he obviously wants her, and he asks her her name, and she says Indravati. Now he becomes very deflated, he becomes very just sad, is a way of putting it, and he sort of just defeatedly asks her what she wants, because he knows the meaning of her name, and he knows that he cannot seduce her, he cannot lay with her or anything. So she reveals to, and just before we go on to that next point, actually, I want to note something. A similarity I feel between Indravati and Luthien from the Lord of the Rings, or rather the Silmarillion. Both of these women are using their beauty. Luthien is said to be the most beautiful of the children of Eluvata, so she obviously has that appeal, that beauty aesthetic appeal, and she uses it. Morgoth, who is the big bad villain of the Silmarillion, his lust is what gives Luthien an opportunity to sort of insert herself in the court, and then it also gives, by proxy, Beren an opportunity to steal the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. And it's Indra's lust that gives Indravati an opportunity to state her case, even though she's not supposed to be in that kingdom, even though she's human and so she can't be in the Fae realm, but it gives her an opportunity to state her case because of her beauty. So it's almost like it has a use beyond just being there for the appraisal of people. And there's a difference between the way that the witches use their beauty, which is always manipulative and always kind of vindictive, and the way that Luthien and Indravati utilize their beauty. It's always for some kind of good. That's not to say that women sort of owe the world their beauty or anything like that, but whereas the witches are using it for chaos, Indravati and Luthien almost use it to assert their authority, which I think is a good way of putting it. So Indravati, and another thing about them is that Indravati and Luthien both take on the masculine role of savior in their stories, but they never compromise their femininity. There's never a moment where you feel like, oh, they're no longer feminine. There's something very powerful about them. But they never have to be brutish. They never have to take on a masculine framework, even though the role of the savior is traditionally a masculine role, but they don't ever become less feminine by taking it on. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. And that's important because a lot of the times the archetype of the witch comes out because women feel restricted in their ability to take on certain roles, and they feel like, okay, it comes from a misunderstanding of how a woman can take on a role that's seen as traditionally masculine. And so the witch comes out like, okay, if I can't do it at all, then I'm just gonna burn everything, which obviously is not the way to go, but there's a use. That's why the archetype comes out. Whereas Indravati and Luthien sort of represent how to do that without actually losing yourself. And so after that request, Indravati makes her plea to Indra and says that the women who are dancing for you are witches. Now, the mark of the witch in this story is that your feet are twisted backwards, so your heel is first. And so when they lift their skirts, when they're forced to lift their skirts, everyone sees that all their heels are twisted backwards and they are banished from the Fae realm, and Indravati gets her husband back and they have a wonderfully described consummation scene in the story. It's a great story. So, like I was saying before that last bit of summary, the story puts a female character in the role of the savior without ever actually compromising her femininity, without ever taking anything away from her as a character or her personality. And the female characters in this story, from the mother, who only really gets one aspect of action, but she is very vital because her decision to name her daughter, that Indravati, comes in handy later on. She's very wise, so there's obviously the feminine attribute of having foresight there. And I think it's really the way that the story carries out its feminine archetypes is very, I wouldn't say impressive, but it's well done, because you see sort of the quote-unquote strong female character, but it's not in any way jarring. It fits because the archetype is allowed to play itself out naturally, and the witches aren't made disgusting hags just to further separate the point, that it shows the complexity of beauty, and that sometimes how we define that and sometimes how it's expressed, and the difference between what is seen as a more pure version of beauty versus a more sensual version of beauty, and how the intention behind how beauty is utilized can be very different, and have very different outcomes. So yeah, I'm just gonna close off the video here because I think I've said enough, and I hope that I've enticed you to read this story because it's very great. It's called Indravati and the Seven Sisters. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that you guys have a lovely day. I'm having a great one so far. But Yeah, have a lovely day. This has been the Malika Rights channel, and I hope to see you next time.